Hi everyone, I'm Sophia Kiani, and I'm very excited to be moderating today's panel, which is Under the Influence of Gen Z, the Sustainable Generation. I'm an environmentalist and climate activist, and I'm the youngest member on the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change and the founder executive director of Climate Cardinals, which is a nonprofit with 8,000 volunteers working to translate climate resources into over 100 languages. I'm passionate about this work, and I gave a TED Talk earlier this year that has over 1 million views. I believe in the need for immediate action across the globe on climate, and I'm thrilled to hold this mic today to talk about the incredible panel and what these companies are doing and what companies should be doing to address the climate crisis and how my generation, Gen Z, is changing the game. So to introduce our panelists today, we have Smitha Shankar, and she was formerly the Senior Vice President of Biomanufacturing at Impossible Foods, currently on a well-deserved sabbatical. And as an early hire at Impossible, Smita led the development and manufacturing of different ingredient that makes Impossible products taste like meat. And Andrew Winston is a globally recognized expert on mega trends and how to build companies that thrive by serving people on the planet. He is widely read. He's a widely read author on sustainable business in the world, and his latest book, Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, is one of Financial Times' best business books of the year. And his first book, Green to Gold, was included on Inc. magazine's all-time list of 30 books that every manager should own. And then Sheila Kim Parker is the CEO and co-founder of Thrilling, which is the premier online marketplace for vintage clothing and home goods from thousands of boutiques across the United States. Thrilling was founded to help minimize fashion's impact on the environment and help indie shops and sellers thrive. And Fast Company just named Thrilling one of the top 10 most innovative companies in retail, and Inc. magazine named Sheila one of the top female founders of 2022. And then we have Tim Giuliani, who's the director of U.S. Corporate Climate Engagement at World Wildlife Fund. He spent 18 years at the nexus of climate, energy policy, and corporate sustainability. And in his role at WWF, he partners with businesses to drive transformative climate solutions and transition to a net zero future. Annie Myong is the president of consumer at Amyris, where she oversees consumer brands, including Pipette, and launched Amyris's, so sorry for the background noise, newest brands, Stripe and Eco Fabulous. And Anne has 30 years of experience transforming businesses to become more sustainable. She has global financial and operating experience in technology, retail, and e-commerce, and was the CVP and CFO at Walmart e-commerce during a period of accelerated growth in the US, China, and Brazil. And so before we launch into this conversation, because I'm a Gen Zer and this panel is about letting Gen Z be heard, I want to share a few of my own reflections informed by the work that I'm doing today. So I believe that young people increasingly are placing importance on sustainability and business. In the last month, I've been to Italy and to India to talk about the importance of taking corporate action and why it matters to Gen Z, because we're increasingly altering our own consumption patterns, and as well as looking for green jobs and really looking to make change happen in the workplace. And when I think about those insights, I think I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all to see what you're doing. So I want to dive right in and pose questions to each of you because I'm interested in real dialogue. So starting with Tim, you've been at the epicenter of climate conversations for a while, and WWF is a trusted NGO and is doing work that goes far beyond protests and sign holding. So you're setting up organizations, and can you explain what they are and why it's important for public orgs, private companies, and NGOs to take a system approach to fighting climate change? And how is Gen Z setting the new agenda for corporate sustainability and climate? And what are the emerging trends?
So that's it, just a couple questions there. And I also want to say, for the record, the headshot that I sent might have been about 4 years old, but the one that you found and used is like well over a decade. So I don't want everybody thinking that I was trying to pull wool over anybody's eyes on that headshot. And I recognize that one of the old white guys is going first. So you're welcome. And thank you, though, for the invite to be here. I have been at WWF for the last 4 years, but I've been working at the nexus of climate and business for going on 20 years now. And It's always been a passion of mine to work on sustainability and at that nexus with corporates, because obviously we're not going to make a difference without the corporate community. Yet we also know that we can't make a difference in the corporate community without holding them accountable. And so that's what we in the NGO community try to do. And that's what we do with the platforms that we work with. So we work with companies both on a one-on-one basis to set targets, ambitious targets, science-based targets, increasingly ones that align with a net zero future. We have a platform that brings companies together in something called our Climate Business Network. We work on the plastics issue, not on my team, but on other teams here at WWF. And we set up and participate in a number of different organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council and Monsucro, and ways that to set standards for a sort of guiding star for how corporates should be looking at setting their paths forward. So there's a lot that we can go into on any of those other strings, but we've got a bunch of other great speakers, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Amazing. And would anyone else like to jump in with reflections on what's just been shared? I would love to turn this into a conversation.
I think I'll just quickly add that WWF, just from my perspective, having worked with companies for a long time, has been working on this a long time and has been a leader. And that one of the critical things that really needs to happen going forward is just a different level of collaboration and partnership. We're not going to solve really big problems like climate change unless we're working together. And I think that means business working with government and with civil society, and organizations like WWF are critical for convening and bringing people together and having these hard conversations about changing really big systems. And I think these things are finally moving. Some of the biggest, hardest challenges, companies are coming together, I think, finally to ask the really big questions about how do they decarbonize. But it's early. There's a long way to go.
I'll just respond to that and say it's early and it's incredibly late at the same time.
Well, yeah, scientifically, yes.
Awesome. And so I'd love to jump over now to Shilla. You said Gen Zers are conscious consumers and we shop around, buy secondhand, and you've called the apparel industry's contribution to climate change appalling. So, what should the industry be doing to help keep so much clothing from ending up in landfills? What is the future of fashion?
So first of all, Sophia, I'm so excited to be here, and especially chatting with you. I think Gen Z is the leading moral heartbeat of our nation, leading the way on so many important social causes, not just climate, but also gun control and women's rights. Gen Z also has $360 billion of spending power, so businesses are paying attention for good reason. Um, Thrilling is a mission-oriented marketplace. We support mom and pop shops, local economies, indie sellers. Our goal is to support that local economy and also to help advance the cause of sustainable shopping. The way we currently make clothes, for the most part, is punishing for our planet. Massively natural resource intensive. Can take up to 1,000 gallons of fresh water just to make a single T-shirt, for example, just as a small example. Apparel industry as a whole is one of the largest emitters of carbon. We unfortunately have developed kind of a disposable relationship with clothes. Clothing has become easily replaceable, cheap, and most folks, unfortunately, will wear clothes a few times, and we end up either throwing them away or donating them. And unfortunately, up to 80% of donations ends up in landfills. To make matters worse, most of our clothes are not biodegradable. There's a lot of plastic in our clothing now. And so and this is not to even touch human rights issues that exist up and down the production chain for apparel. However, I don't think the responsibility should lie entirely with the consumer. Just like the other panelists said, I feel like it's going to take a broad coalition to really advance change at the scale and the pace that we really urgently need. I look to successful examples of that in the past. I think we did that really successfully with tobacco, for example. Congress passed a law in 1965 to slap warning labels on cigarette boxes, and yet smoking rates didn't really change until 2002, 37 years later. I think consumers, if left just to consumers, were notoriously bad at self-regulation. With tobacco, it took taxes and tight regulations around the production and sale and distribution of cigarettes. And it took massive, well funded public campaigns and social pressure. And so I do think it'll take a broad coalition. I don't think the onus should rest solely with the consumer. And I'm enormously hopeful.
Awesome. And I guess some follow-up questions would be, what do you think is the future of fashion in terms of more wardrobe sharing businesses? Oops. Are there any other new innovations that you're exploring?
I get really excited. There's a lot going on in material science, which I think is really cool. I personally get really excited by business model innovations. I do think we're going to have to seriously grapple with the idea that endless growth is not necessarily sustainable for people and planet. And so things like, Patagonia really famously recently, the founder gave up his and his family's ownership in Patagonia and put it in a trust, and the proceeds will help fund climate efforts. And Selfridges in the UK, which is a department store chain in the UK, they announced that within 10 years, 50% of their revenue is going to be derived from resale, rental, refills, or repair. And I think that type of innovation and grappling with kind of core business model evolution is going to be necessary in order to make some of the changes at the scale and pace that we need to make them.
And do you have any thoughts on innovations with materials, raw materials, and how do you juxtapose that with innovations in terms of like sharing and secondhand?
I I'm not necessarily an expert in what's been going on in material science. There's a lot of really cool innovations and research going into how do we make new types of materials that can be sustainably produced. Um, I am always a little bit wary when the business model is kind of hinges on the assumption that we'll continue to consume at the same rates. So I think that is great, but we also are going to need, again, some business model evolutions. I love it when businesses start to think about how can they incorporate resale, to your point, secondhand, circularity of the consumption cycle. I think that's really important and a necessary complement to material science.
Awesome. Does anyone else have thoughts on the future of sustainability in fashion?
I know it's counterintuitive, but I think the comments that Sheila made about repair and recycle, um, it's all been about newness and consumption and buying new fashion. But my experience with the Board of Goodwill would say that retailers that encourage that kind of behavior, you actually build more trust and loyalty with consumers. And I think particularly with the Gen Z consumer, where you're not always trying to sell something new, you're trying to encourage the sharing and the continuation of what is still a very, high quality piece of clothing that can have a new life either with yourself or somebody else. So I think that's a large part of this industry and just, ensuring that you build a longer term relationship with the consumer, and particularly the Gen Z.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. And so I would love to move on. Schmida to Impossible was really a trailblazer in terms of exploring how biotech can make something damaging to the planet like red meat and make impactful change. So, what role does biotech play in the future of food and consumer goods?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. Before I answer that question, I just want to take a step back and kind of recollect with people how I joined Impossible Foods, right? My background was molecular biology, genetics. I'm a scientist. Like many people at Amyris are familiar with the kind of work I do. Um, and when I joined Impossible, it wasn't because it was a company trying to make food. I think what Impossible Foods did was kind of redefine the way to make food, right? So I joined the company because it stood for a technology, a novel technology, a novel way of making foods, which is better for the planet. So this was 10, 11 years back when it wasn't so well known what the impact of animal agriculture or the way food production currently continues and how that impacts the planet, right? So for me, knowing that that's such a huge driver for climate change and that I could use my skills, which until that point I thought were not applicable to food in any way, and have this massive impact. So I think biotechnology has huge potential, and what we have been doing in the last decade or so, and certainly for a long time before that in therapeutics and in drugs, but in the last decade or so, we have seen that you could use the power of biotechnology to make a lot of different types of foods, to make a different types of products. Food is just one. In fact, just going to materials, as Sheila was just talking about, you could use synthetic biology to make new types of materials. You could use it to make cosmetics, and a lot of different innovation that's actually in the pipeline. And that's what I'm really excited about because I think we've kind of paved that path for thinking differently about anything that can be made using conventional methods, which are not good for the planet. And the most important thing is it gets scientists, engineers, people thinking innovatively about new ways of doing things and then finding ways to make it economically feasible because that's the only true way to disrupt the business as usual.
Amazing. And in terms of kind of some follow up questions, what did Impossible get right that other companies you think can learn from that made you guys different?
Yeah, I think we had a very solid North Star, right? So our founder, Pat Brown, was very clear what the company stood for. It was the mission of the company. It was the fact that the way animal agriculture is continued doesn't work, that we need to find alternatives, and we can't preach to people. We have to create products that are just as good. We have to give consumers choice, and I think that was something we got right, and focused on making a product that was delicious, making a product that was good for people. They enjoyed it. They liked the taste, making it at a price point that people could buy it. And then having it be sustainable. I do want to comment one thing about Gen Z, right? As we are talking about, Gen Z has these strong preferences and trends. I want to quote one of my colleagues who said, this is not a trend like someone wanting to wear bell bottoms in the 60s. Gen Z is inheriting a planet that's in trouble. This is an existential problem. They really want to solve this problem, and they are incentivized actually to really hold our generation accountable and say, what are you doing? How are you solving these problems? And so I think we got that right at Impossible, thinking about solving something that's very important, but not taking the approach of um, preaching or guilting, but rather saying, how do I make a delicious product? How do I innovate? How do I drive the costs down and put that in front of consumers and say, here's what you're looking for, tastes like meat, but didn't have the impact that meat production has. And then the one other thing I will say is, it's like making in addition to running you have to run a good business. You have to be sustainable and you have to do good. And I think Impossible stood by that as well. We were very strong about our values, and always stood by them, whether it was, donating food to people in need due to natural disasters, and outreach and education, science education, supporting social causes that we believed in. And so we really are very particular about staying true to who we are. And I think that's something Impossible got right as well.
And for the rest of you, what do you think is stuff that you guys were able to get right that other companies haven't, or anything that makes the companies that you work for unique?
I'll just say as a general comment, I think something that Impossible did really well. I always believe you can't force people to eat spinach. You can't just force people to do things just because it's good for them. And we have to be honest with the fact that we, need to be delighted, and we make decisions based on delight and pleasure. And so making a product that tasted great and didn't taste like cardboard, and we have to eat it because it's better for you. We try to apply that principle at Thrilling. How can we present vintage and secondhand shopping, not just as this is good for you and this is supporting a small business owner, but how can we present it to folks who may be wary of secondhand shopping and present it to them in a intuitive and delightful way. So we think about that philosophy a lot in terms of consumer product.
I
And
just
Yeah, I would totally.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to share an example that, I have a 12-year-old now, but one of our earliest products I had shared with my daughter, and I was like, this is great. She thought it was delicious, right? But she was like, this is plant-based. And she's like, I could eat plant-based if you give me food that tastes so good. So.
And just to underscore that, I think what Smitha and Sheila said is just so spot on, that you need to offer something that is delightful. It's a great customer experience. It's accessible from a price point, and I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it also, something that allows you to shop your values. And I think from what Impossible did, being able to create something that is just so much part of our daily life, but making it delicious and accessible and available to the masses. I mean, that's how you're going to drive change, which is not to make something so expensive that it's only available to a very small set of consumers. And, I think that's something that's really important for us at Amherst, which I can talk about a little bit. But I think we can't forget that we're all consumers, and we love to consume, but we want to consume responsibly. We want to know, where does it come from? We want to be able to trace the supply chain all the way back. We want transparency. And I would say that that's, I'm learning so much from my Gen Z daughters, but I think this is the human condition, right? It's not just one generation, but I would say that, the Gen Z customers bar, despite maybe their pocketbook, how much money they have to spend, the bar has been set incredibly high. And I love that because, we're learning, we're not just assuming and trusting, but trust and verify, right? We need to be able to understand where things come from, where they're made, how they're made, and, where the raw materials come from and the impact on the entire, ecosystem.
I think what's interesting for Gen Z, in a way they're really lucky, is that they weren't around for when the early versions of greener products kind of sucked. I mean, the first attempts in a lot of categories were hard, right? Like recycled paper didn't go through like printers very well. And and so it created this lasting impression, I think, in everybody over like 30, that green products have to be worse. And now,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's things like Tesla made, cars and electric vehicles sexy. and Impossible and Beyond have made eating non-meat amazing. And it's they just expect that there's not trade-offs. And I think that's really great for driving more change in business. And I think these two categories we've been talking about, like apparel and food, are where really two of the biggest footprint industries. And I think there's more like fluidity in how younger people view consumption. I think discussions in the past about vegetarian or vegan were kind of all or nothing. I'm a vegetarian and my family enjoys the alternative burgers a lot. It doesn't reduce our footprint more. We weren't eating meat anyways. But I think the rise of, vegan till 6 or Monday vegetarians or whatever all these things are, there's just more flexibility, and it doesn't feel like you have to do everything. And I feel like, especially Gen Z, I have two Gen Z boys. They're just more kind of fluid in their thinking about these things and can try different things, and just expect that they don't expect the trade-offs. They expect that they'll be able to find the better products and they'll be more sustainable just by nature.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I mean, I obviously agree with all of that, and I think it's the the idea that we're all consumers and we love to consume is right. And this climate change is a consumption problem as much as anything, right? And that uh, changing consumer behavior is incredibly hard. And people buying the right thing because it's the right thing isn't going to be enough to save the planet, right? The bottom up approach is important, but I know that I buy the wrong thing enough times, and this is what I do for a living. That it's that's not going to work. It really needs to be from the top down, and that's where corporations come in, right? Because they're the ones that are there making the change for people, whether it's Impossible, whether it's Tesla. I can remember my first cell phone with a 1 megapixel camera, right? And I had no idea how much I needed to take pictures of my cats and food. And, the decision for me was not, was made for me that I really needed a supercomputer in my pocket, right? Because within 10 years, I had an iPhone. And then I had a video phone. And those things weren't things I was necessarily clamoring for, but they were things that, I ended up buying. When you look back at the ozone layer issue, which was, pre really, Gen Z being born, we had the the issue of chlorofluorocarbons and what those were doing to the ozone layer, causing all kinds of problems. We created the Montreal Protocol, which was the equivalent of the Paris Agreement, of the time, and we had a very rapid change in phasing out those chemicals. But the reason was not because everybody decided to do the right thing. It was because DuPont and others had a chemical substitute that was both economical and could be dropped in. And the choice was essentially taken away from people. It wasn't buying one thing that was more expensive and the polluting one was still out there. It was just a wholesale change. So I think that is the we have to shop our values, absolutely, but we also have to have those alternatives readily available, and not at a price point that doesn't allow the average consumer to do it.
Yeah, one thing we learned from a lot of our consumer studies was, what consumers care about when it comes to food, right? Taste, price, accessibility. Those are the three top things. Even nutrition, and then nutrition is one of the factors, but the top three things are, I want this to taste really good. I want to be able to afford it, and I want to be able to find it. And I think those are the things we went after.
That's a question I actually wanted to pose to everyone. How do you think about balancing accessibility when it comes to accelerating sustainability, in the sense of how do you make things at a price point that's accessible to especially especially Gen Z consumers?
Well, I think you have to start with the end in mind. And, for us at Amyris, when we just launched a brand of skincare and beauty, you know, for everyone, but for particularly for the Gen Z consumer called Eco Fabulous. And we really started from a place of accessibility and price accessibility as well as performance. And so maybe just to take a step back, at Amyris, we are also a biotech company. What we do is discover molecules and basically bioengineer them that you would find in nature, but we do that through fermentation. And we essentially come up with an identical molecule that you would find in nature. And so for us, we have discovered a synthetic version of squalane, which is something you would find in many beauty products as an emollient. And so we are able to use our science, build up products that are from a cost of goods sold and from a margin perspective, much more scalable, much more sustainable, and much more accessible to a lot of people, a lot of consumers. And if you start with that end in mind and you say, for this consumer, for this market, we need to be in a certain price point to make it accessible to a lot more people. I think that's where you are able to work with not only your suppliers when it comes to packaging, raw material suppliers, contract manufacturers, just designing that all into your product so that in effect, you can reach so many more consumers. And for us too, we thought about this from a packaging standpoint. We don't want our consumers to throw away and dispose of a package when they're finished. And so what we also thought about was how do we make these refills accessible? Design that in right away, offer that to our consumers. So again, it's really, I think, just thinking through the entire end-to-end design of the product, the branding, the price point, the accessibility, the distribution, so that you can reach many more customers with a product that is, based in sustainability.
Those were great points, Anne, and I just want to add that I actually use the squalane tea tree oil. It's amazing. But one of the things to I think fully agree, right? I think we need innovation and for novel technologies to actually plan out the timeline of how long it will take to scale to make these technologies work. As you know, fermentation at large scale is non-trivial, and so getting those things to work, drive the cost down, and truly have the right people working on it and have the right kind of capital going into these incentives is very important.
You're exactly right. I think these innovations are decades in the making. And so, this is not something that was discovered overnight, but is now at scale that we're able to bring this to scale and to so many more consumers, just like you were able to do with Impossible Foods. And so, I think again, the convergence of the demand, the Gen Z expectations, the transparency, the traceability, working with organizations like WWF, Tim, right? This is something, again, the partnership between corporations and trusted organizations like WWF to really kind of hold up the mirror and set standards and objective standards that corporations can um, you know, uh, adhere to in a way that is traceable and objective, and just holding ourselves accountable to each other, I think is really where we're all headed. And I think we need all of those parties at the table to make sure that we have those checks and balances, if you will. But I think it's something that for corporations, it's if it's part of your strategy and your North Star, you should welcome that as a partnership.
It's
That's
interesting.
such a good point that you brought up, and I actually, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that that's such a good point that was brought up, and that's a follow up question I had for everyone. In that you talk about the partnership with WWF, and that's something where I think that there's the nonprofit end, the governance end, and then the corporate end. So, how can we bring those all together, do you all think, to accelerate climate solutions?
Well,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
could I could take a crack.
sorry, go ahead, Tim.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Tim.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll be quick and say, yes, you need all three parts of that, right? So, Andrew and I been at this for a while, and can remember the mid 2000s, late 2000s. We were trying to get a big climate bill through Congress, emissions trading bill that was going to be, economy wide, comprehensive, that would have forced a lot of companies to do this work. And that didn't work out for any number of reasons. And we've been in the last decade here at the federal level at a place where we have to do it with voluntary, right? And in fact, we sort of followed that same path on the international level. The Kyoto Protocol had been a very top-down target and timetable. The developed world does one thing, the developing world does another. And we went through a dozen years of that, and it didn't work. And now we have the Paris Agreement, which is sort of a bottom-up approach, right? On the corporate side, we went into that period of voluntary without uh, a way of being able to hold companies accountable on targets. And a number of groups, including WWF, started thinking, okay, how do we create that North Star that we've all been talking about around target setting? And that's where the Science Based Targets Initiative came from, saying that it's great that companies are setting targets, and they've been setting them for years, but how do we ensure that they're doing it in a way that's aligned with science and that's going to get us to where we need to go on net zero? And so we created SBTI, and it has created that North Star for what it would take. But that's not enough either, right? We've had science-based targets for years. There are over 3,000 companies now that are committed or have set targets, hundreds now that are committed to setting net zero targets. Yet every year, fossil fuels continue to go up. Emissions globally continue to go up, right? So obviously, much more has to be done. And I still truly believe we can't get out of this problem without more government intervention. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest action congressionally on climate ever. $380 billion that's going towards this work. But with the exception of a small methane fee, it's all carrots. There are no sticks. And unfortunately, we can't live on just carrots. I suppose I like carrots, but really in a much more combined way. Usually with little, my wife does it with some sugar and caramelizes them, but that's another story. So we actually need action, and that's where I think one of the most important things that Gen Zers can do is get out and vote. Right, next week, 2 weeks, we have an election. 10% of the electorate in 2020 was Gen Z. 8 million more between 2020 and 22. So getting out and making sure that we have a government that takes this issue seriously and then can help with that trifecta of the consumer, corporates, and government, I think is a way toward the promised land.
Yeah.
I wanted to add that in addition to government and corporate, I do think there is also a role for academic institutions, right? How people are coached in universities and education system. I just think that that's something to keep in mind as we are thinking about here are the next set of big problems facing us as a society, and where are we going to need the skills over the next few decades? And I think really. Coordinating that with what type of problems need to be solved. I think they play a big role as well, and shouldn't forget about that.
And that's a huge point, and I think Gen Z has this enormous role, and they've already done this, and younger millennials in pressuring and making clear at the universities, especially grad schools, MBA programs, that they want more content on sustainability, right? That they want help being trained in this and career paths, and that's I think what's going to change schools the most. I mean, employers saying we need these skills is big, but I think from inside the students pushing for this has amazing power. So I mean, I know a lot of the questions today are about like the voice of Gen Z, um, and I think it's real. I mean, whenever you hear, I guess those of us who've been in this field for a while, and people say, well, Gen Z is going to save us. They're going to tackle climate. Like that's unfair on many levels. And also they don't have the power yet, right? They can now vote, which is critical, but they're not running companies. They're not, in charge. So they have to apply pressure as, as buyers of products, as voters, and as, employees. I think maybe most of all, like where do you go work as a Gen Zer? Where will you put your time and energy, and make it clear that you won't go to a company that doesn't have its values in line, that isn't doing the right thing.
I think
And once you're there,
that's
oh, sorry.
well, I was just going to say the academic point is really key, because the cross-discipline nature of programs now allow you to think about economics, business, the environment, science. I mean, I think that kind of education just sets us up, this future generation, so well to tackle these issues. What I think you also triggered in my mind was also the role of corporate governance. So there's corporations from the inside, from management, and setting the strategies, thinking about this as a long-term, short-term, medium-term, long-term investment, but also from a corporate governance and from a board standpoint, and how boards are formed, and how much time you spend incorporating, these objectives into your corporate strategies, your ethos, your leadership choices. I mean, this is, as you said, bottoms up and top down, and so it's also from a corporate standpoint, not only management but also corporate governance as well.
Yeah, on both those points, I'd say on the education side, yeah, absolutely yes. I think that one of the keys is similar to what we've been saying to corporations for decades, which is that sustainability can't be an add-on. It has to be part of your core strategy, right? That also has to be true in education. That
Yeah.
we shouldn't just have sustainability programs that are over here on the side, and some students take those, and then they go out and they try to get sustainability degrees or jobs, and because often, I mean, we mint a lot of those, and there are only so many jobs, right? What has to be is that sustainability is part of all of the business degrees. It's part of all of the degrees that we have that are sending this generation and every generation after that into the workforce, so that it is truly embedded in the way we think. And my personal opinion is that companies that are sustainable do better because they are holistically managed, right? They're thinking about risk across, the broadest spectrum. That's not to say that you can't be profitable and be unsustainable. The entire oil industry is an example of that at the moment. But that I would also say that the um, what I was thinking of there just completely flew out of my head. So I'm just going to stop talking.
I agree with that. It reminds me a lot of the conversation around DEI initiatives and approach sometimes companies would take by kind of siloing that function. And I have a lot of great friends in positions like that, and I think they do great work. But ultimately, you really need that to be embedded into the culture, and everybody's job needs to be advancing those values and those core principles. So I completely agree.
I remember now. It was the importance, as Andrew was saying, of engaging. When you do get the job, right? Engaging at the corporate level. There's a group out there called Climate Voice, which is working with employees to get the companies they work for talking about climate policy and lobbying for it, to try to get them to spend at least one out of every $5 lobbying on climate, because so many times the companies we work with and for say one thing about climate change and the environment, and then their lobbying ends up looking very different. And so holding not only looking for companies that are saying that they're doing the right thing, but once you get inside, making sure that you hold them accountable to doing it.
Yeah.
I think a great point was brought up around the idea of education and literacy. So I'm kind of curious to know how much of the work you all are doing is more consumer facing in the sense of not just innovating your businesses to be more sustainable, but also educating consumers about the importance of sustainability and making sure that your products are getting in the right hands.
Yeah.
We're doing a lot
I
of
can say a little bit there again. Like I think there is a fine line here to walk on, because you want to be transparent, you want to educate, but you don't want to get into the preach territory, right? So with consumers. So I think what we try to do, like what IF did when I was there, was we did, like I said, we did a lot of outreach and education towards like schools and more science education, broader education that way. We always opened up our labs for tours, like media tours. People could come and we would show them how our process worked and things like that. The transparency and openness, and speaking openly if questions came up, talking through concerns and problems, questions people had. That was the approach. In addition to again science education and outreach education, and I thought that worked really well for us.
Yeah, in a similar way, educating about why the ingredients that don't take from nature are as good or even better for you and for the planet. And so sharing the science, sharing how it's made, um, sharing the impact that if you make this choice, how it's better for the planet, how it actually saves the lives of animals by making this choice. So again, not to be preachy, but to demonstrate how, as a consumer, if you make a better choice, it does have a positive impact. And again, back to that customer or consumer delight, the experience is just as good or better. So it's really a win-win, and it's really interesting and backed by science, which I think is fascinating for for so many, to understand like how is this actually made, and why should I choose this product over something else?
Mhm.
one of
And
the things
Anne,
that
Gen Z is, oh, sorry, Gen Z consumers are setting the bar high for businesses when it comes to sustainability and a commitment to protecting the planet. But pricing can be a hurdle. So, do consumers feel priced out? And if so, what should companies do to address it so better choices are more accessible and attainable?
Yeah, we've certainly heard that feedback as we were designing this brand that I mentioned earlier. And so, we consciously decided to set the price where it was in that sweet spot of accessibility, but believability, because I think if you try to go with a price point that's too low, then you start to question the veracity of the ingredients. And so, that was exactly what we heard from our research. And all of these products are priced at, below $20. Again, that's not inexpensive, but at the same time, as my colleagues on this panel said, you have to run a sustainable, in this sense, and profitable business, and but make it accessible to a lot more people. So, um, yeah, for us, we just have to really work with, all of our suppliers. We think about it holistically from packaging, and I mentioned before, making sure that we can reuse the packaging. We encourage reuse of part of packaging. We send the refillable product, and educate that when we sell the initial product, that this is how you continue to use this product responsibly. And so I think that not only appeals to Gen Z, but really to all consumers, when making these choices.
And I'd also love to ask Andrew. So, my generation's looking for solutions and action. So, can you talk to me about what you see as the most impactful steps that companies are taking, where they need to go next, and how Gen Z can make sure our voices continue to be heard?
I study and kind of work on megatrend and the big forces driving this deep change in business. And I'm not just saying this because we're talking about Gen Z, but when I do a lot of speaking, I work with large companies and their executive teams, and I really make the case that in addition to the pressure of the giant problems we face, like climate and inequality, and stakeholder pressure from investors, from employees, from communities, there's really like two big trends that are, I think, driving this, into a kind of permanent change. And one we talked about, which is transparency, just the ability and the desire to get more data on everything and know the story of every product. But the biggest one I do think is generational change. And I've been talking about millennials as young people for a number of years, and they're not as young anymore. They kind of don't like to hear that, but the upper end are hitting 40, and have real lives, families, kids, houses. They're in the thick of it. But both millennials and Gen Z, and there's survey after survey shows, just have a different attitude about business and wanting values and where they work. And so I really do believe that the younger members of the business world, as employees and as buyers, they are really changing the norms, because that's what really changes things. Is you can kind of push people, you can try to offer them products, but it has to be a real change in what's expected of a company and of a product. And so the younger generation is creating, I think, the biggest pressure point, and I hear it from CEOs, I hear it from executives, that they're kind of nervous about satisfying this younger generation. And there's an incredible war for talent right now. There's not enough people for jobs, and so it's really, there's a lot of power in the younger people that are entering the workforce about who they choose to work for. And as Tim said, going in there and making your voice heard. And I think there's just more bluntness to younger workers now. They will speak truth to executives, and they should continue doing that. And I think they're part of the reason you see change. Companies that weren't doing much, like Amazon for years, it was their employees that started making public statements, signing, public. They kind of did an open letter about climate and what their company was doing, and it pushed them to do more, to care more. And you're seeing companies, getting ahead of the curve. Now the leaders are doing very cool things. They're setting really big goals. They're trying to, tackle carbon in an aggressive way, especially the tech companies. And I think it's the pressure from within is one of the biggest reasons. So, I mean, it's part of what gives me hope in this space. And it is tough. I mean, the climate is in trouble. Our democracy is in trouble. These are really hard times, but I think the norms are changing, and that's a permanent change. And as soon as we kind of get the old ideas out and the newer ideas in, there's just going to be much quicker and more systemic change.
And anyone else, do you have thoughts on Gen Z making sure that our voices can be heard, and in terms of how corporations are responding, if there's any good news to share?
I think one of the challenges in apparel has been around data collection. And in terms of informing and educating the consumer, there's been a lot of mistrust because so often wishy-washy data is used for greenwashing purposes. And so consumers have naturally become a little bit more skeptical about understanding or believing what's true and what's not true, with good reason. And so I think we're seeing, I've joined a coalition with other resale marketplaces and other sustainable apparel companies to push for legislation that would help invest in improved data collection infrastructure and reporting infrastructure. And we're starting to see judgments come out against companies who are using data inappropriately or inaccurately. We saw a judgment in New York and in Europe against H&M, for example. So I think that's heading in the right direction and has been one of the key challenges in terms of educating the consumer. Yeah.
Well, I totally agree with the points that have been made about, voices as employees voting. But the other thing as a block of consumers, the purchasing power of Gen Z is huge. And there's nothing that's going to get the attention of corporations more quickly than that. And so, coupled with just the savviness of the generation around social media and providing feedback and just making voices heard, what you like, what you don't like, feedback on products. These are all incredibly powerful tools that this generation has and just knows natively. And so I would just continue to use every means and every lever to speak your truth, use your purchasing power and your feedback across so many different dimensions, whether it's as a voter, or as an employee, or as an activist, Sophia, as you are. There's no time to waste. And what I love about this generation is, as Andrew said, there's no waiting, and there's very much a directness about what you want. So I would just say continue to work across all those dimensions.
Amazing. Well, we are coming up on time, and I've really enjoyed hearing all of your different perspectives given the different verticals that you work with. So, I wanted to say maybe if there's any final words that you all have to add or final takeaways that you would like our audience, now is the time.
Please vote and bring 10 people with you.
Honestly, I'm going to second that. I think that especially for young people, we have such a responsibility to vote. Voter turnout among young people has been abysmal in a lot of cases. And I think that if we really do want to see action, it comes from a systemic level. And it's great to see what corporates are doing, but also our government and political processes is going to play a huge role and be hugely influential as well. So vote, make sure your parents vote. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining me today. It was incredible to hear your insights, and I'm sure that the future is going to look a lot greener when corporates continue to take meaningful and sustainable action.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Sophia. Thank you.